Froment. She is the Global Feasibility Operations Director at Amgen. She's working with teams on studies and optimizing trial designs for operational delivery. And as a part of a new trial design function in Amgen, Amy has been closely involved in the development and implementation of a wide range of organizational change initiatives. She has a pharmacology BSc in biological sciences from the University of Manchester. And when she's not designing these studies, she enjoys the burn of running half marathons. So please welcome Amy Froment.
Thank you very much. So thank you for a lovely introduction, Victoria. So it's a real honour to be here. So I just wanted to echo Michael's comments that for me to have an opportunity to really particularly talk directly with you guys as patients at the front here is a real honour. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think. And the aim of the discussion, you see, is to have a really interactive discussion. So we may need a few more mics at the front when we get to that stage, but really want to hear what you guys think. And Victoria covered it in my introduction, but before I go in to talk about the detail, my role's very much in trial design at Amgen. So I've been doing that role for about 2.5 years. So my role, my experience is from actually running clinical trials and running clinical programs, principally in cardiovascular. But now I work across the Amgen portfolio, which not only covers cardiovascular, it covers a range of diseases, inflammation. Amgen do a lot of work in oncology as well. My role is to work with every study team in Amgen that designs a clinical study and help them think about the way to make that trial most operationally feasible. And that comes from inputs from patients, which I'm going to talk about today, also from sites themselves that run the studies, the people that we have located in our countries to understand how those trials may work differently depending on the cultural differences and the difference of running trials locally in particular countries, as well as just the breadth of experience of working with all the expertise within Amgen and the previous experience on studies. So we basically bring everyone together in a room, we work with lots of data and we help them make decisions to inform their trial design. So we don't design the trials for them, we just help them by helping their decision making. So, but what I'm going to talk today is how we bring patient perspectives and how we plan to do that in study design, which is very important to us in Amgen. So I first have a legal blurb here, which I won't read word for word, but essentially it's just saying that the aim is, Amgen is a commercial entity. We're committed to being science-based and we're fully compliant with all of our governing laws. Balance is important, so we have a law and compliance standpoint that's been reviewed in executing our science-based activities. And the spirit of this presentation is to be fully compliant with all of those laws and regulations. So I shall move on. So what do I want to talk to you about? I want to give you an overview of how we seek patient perspectives during design. Some of those are directly from patients themselves. Others are just trying to think from a patient viewpoint when we're designing our studies. As I mentioned, and hopefully request, being the first session, so you're not particularly warmed up yet, I'm hoping we can have an active discussion and hear lots of your feedback, because certainly that's my primary kind of reason for being here, is to really hear what you guys think. So when we get to the discussion, I'll be asking, what's important to consider as we conduct all of these activities that I talk about to seek patient perspectives. People talk about it a lot, about how the patient view is important. Are we focusing on the right things to seek those views and be able to incorporate them into our designs? What do you as patients expect from us as a sponsor company? What should we be thinking about when we design our trials? When we say we have you in mind, do we have the right perspective of the patient in mind? And what I'm going to talk about today is the tactics that we're beginning to focus on first, but we plan to expand the activities that we do to connect with our patients. And so which ones should we be thinking about next? And also, do people have experience of either using or participating in some of the tactics I'm going to talk about? And what's gone well and what hasn't gone so well? I'd really like to hear about that as well. So Amgen's focused in 6 areas across the business in what we call incorporating the patient voice. So, and this goes right across the drug development in its totality. So you see here there's the target product profile, which is really, I guess, the blurb about the drug that we say. How do we describe this drug? What indications are we targeting? What's the patient that we're targeting? And that's what will go to the regulators and ultimately be approved for when the drug goes to market. The dosing experience, so how can we make that as positive as possible for our patients. Clinical trial effectiveness is what I'm going to focus on today, so that's about our clinical trial design. Not only from a business point of view, making sure we can operationalise those as efficiently as possible, but also making them as positive as possible for those patients that participate in them. Patient-reported outcomes, so those are the questionnaires and the measures that we use, and we directly ask patients to answer those questions as a measure of the disease during the studies. So how can we design those to be as optimal as possible? When we're making our regulatory filing applications, so we're beginning to involve patients in those as well. And then the product support programs. So when a drug is marketed, what kind of programs and initiatives do we need to support patients in as users of our products as well? So, to give a bit more detail, so across the top here are the main phases of drug development that we're seeking patient perspectives in at the moment. So in phase 1 and 2, these are the very early phases of drug development. What's important in terms of those patient voice activities? So what's critical very early is to understand the clinical disease management and really what's important from that perspective. Both from a commercial perspective and from a patient perspective, what needs are there that are currently unmet? What's important to address? And then even at these early stages to obtain feedback on that clinical trial design. So when you get through into phase 3, those are the much larger, later phase studies that involve many more patients. So in engaging patients in those, we're trying to improve the way we recruit patients. We retain them in the study, so patients want to continue in the study and therefore generate meaningful data through that. And then, as I've spoken about, trying to maximise the chances of that positive experience while participating in the trial. So ensuring that we can enrol the trial as quickly as possible. So holistically, that has benefits for everyone, but ultimately it's about delivering the science faster, and then we can deliver the drugs as fast as possible to meet those unmet needs. Key data and communication plans. So it's really important that those participants in the study, we can communicate with them to tell them about their data. So that's something we can be informed about and what works. What are the current gaps in disease state education? And so how can we address those? That we can really seek some feedback there. And understand the issues that are a huge challenge in today's landscape in terms of patient access and clinical use once the drug is marketed. So post-approval, how can we continue to educate those key audiences, both as patients and healthcare professionals? So where are the gaps there? Where are the additional data needs? So what additional studies do we need to do to address the gaps in the scientific data? Partnering on those approaches for patient access, so continuing to support that. Guideline committees and ensuring that they have access to all the evidence, so the decisions that they're making are based on the science. And then capturing that real-world patient data, which is so important. And certainly in my role, I'm using a huge amount of actual patient electronic health record data to see where patients are and how they're being treated to try and inform where we place clinical trials in the future. So why is it important? I think these are things that you'll all be familiar with, but it's certainly worth saying from an Amgen perspective. So we want to understand much better what patients' real unmet needs are, but really from your perspective as patients, not just people thinking about the patient perspective and talking about it. How can we improve our trial planning, but actually developing more meaningful endpoints? So in terms of proving or answering the question with the scientific data we generate, are we answering a question that's important to patients themselves and the priorities that they want to address in their disease? So we had a workshop yesterday that was great, and I was in a group talking about complex regional pain syndrome. Is that the name? Yeah, thank you. And it was about, we really were thinking about what would be important for the patient. Is it about having less pain? Is it about having greater mobility or less swelling? And so what's greater priority? And, there might be an assumption if you were in a team designing a trial that's the wrong one, and actually asking the patient what's more important and what should be your primary endpoint in the study to address. So that certainly really gave me an opportunity to think about that a lot more. So patient experience, I've talked about this as well. So we talk a lot in design about burden, patient burden during trial design. So what procedures are putting the greatest burden on the patient, and not only from a perspective of willingness to participate, but also willingness to continue to participate, because the data is only as good as, you know, getting a complete data set during the study, and we want a patient's participation to be meaningful. So we need to support that in making the trial as inclusive as possible in the first place, but also as easy as possible to participate in as well. You know, it's not, I don't think we can ever make a study that's not going to inconvenience a patient in some way, or maybe in the future if we can just capture data while you're at home from your phone without you having to do anything. But at the moment, you know, a lot of trials involve coming into a clinic, so there's some level of inconvenience there. But recruitment and retention is obviously really key. We need to be able to get that data and bring it into for analysis so that we can actually inform getting drugs approved and out to the market so patients can benefit from them. And two-way communication. So that can be challenging. There's lots of regulations around that, so I'm sure many of you will be aware. So it's important that after the trial, we can have that avenue of communication open. There are many tactics for seeking feedback from patients. These are the 4 that Amgen have focused on first, but there are many others that we're considering and thinking about. So the first one is facilitated review. So this is something we use during design sessions and doesn't involve patients directly, but it's basically a role play exercise for the teams designing the studies to actually really think about and put themselves in the patient's shoes. And what this helps with is really having the team actually learn more about the patient experience. So again, you're taking it a step further from saying what is often easy, oh, I'm thinking about the patient, but actually putting in the position where they're really thinking, and then they're being challenged on their thinking as well, so it becomes a much more focused discussion. So those are done in sessions, and then we use the output of those sessions to update the study design. Study simulation. So this is where patients and site staff simulate the study visit as a role-play situation in the site setting. And that can be either one visit or a series of visits, and it's done according to the way the study is designed. And then we take feedback from that and take that back into the design process. Patient panels. So moderated discussion with patients and caregivers, and that's very direct. We get our insights directly and incredibly flexible, so it can be done at various stages to inform a whole host of different things. And then online patient community. So there's an online forum to get feedback, to improve that development and to educate, but also to identify patients and potentially recruit them into clinical trials as well. So those are the 4 areas. So I'm going to talk about each one in a bit more detail. So as I mentioned, facilitated review really enables teams to take everything out of the discussion apart from the patient experience and really focus on that during the session. And really thinking about the patient perspective and then the way that behaviour and that patient experience will be informed by the various procedures in the study. So firstly, looking at the patient experience, so an educational programme and synthesising that existing knowledge. So the starting point is to really begin to build the knowledge about patient experience and understand the condition and what we call the related patient behaviours to that condition. And then help the team identify first what they don't know, or maybe where their assumptions need some more data to support them. And so that really sets the frame for the activity in terms of the questions that we're aiming to answer. And then the facilitated review is done through a series of sessions. So we map out the patient journey. This is a phrase which I'm sure many of you will have heard, but there's a clinical trial patient journey and a commercial patient journey that are very differentiated. And in this setting, we focus on the clinical trial patient journey. So this is really how as a patient you will move in or operate within the healthcare system, and where are the access points and actual points of risk that we may lose you from a clinical trial as well. So we can really understand and get to know the touch points with the healthcare system and the healthcare professionals. And not only do we build a central kind of assumed global patient journey, we then send that out and have people in each country validate it and tell us what's different in their country about how those patients may move through the healthcare system. So this enables a team to prioritise what are beautifully called leverage points on this slide. So this is really about where can we, really be able to understand where patients might be that will be able to access a clinical trial. And how, for example, can we advertise in those spaces to let patients know that trials exist? And then taking those insights and recommendations, what are the objectives for the patient? How would we want them to feel in the clinical trial? And how would we kind of support them in adhering to the procedures and taking the medication as instructed, etc., like that. So then taking those things in and changing the study design. So we need to prioritise those changes based on two main things. What's most important to the patient, of course, and that's paramount and why we're doing this, but what's also feasible to implement. So it's got to work with the design, it's got to maintain the integrity of the science, which of course is the most important thing. We want to generate high quality data that's going to inform us being able to bring those medicines to patients. So the next one I'm going to talk about is study simulation. So as I mentioned, this is where there's a role play conducted at a study site, and a series of visits or just a single study visit is conducted according to the schedule of assessments. So I've actually used the output of one of these from a paediatric study for steroid-induced osteoporosis, which was hugely insightful. So interventional procedures are not actually conducted. So, for example, but all of the kind of setup is, so as it says here, for example, a patient would be positioned for an X-ray, but the X-ray would not actually be conducted. And that's to try and really walk through everything that you would need to go through to participate in the study and really assess what the burden of that is. And even just like walking between the various departments for the visit, is that even reasonable given the condition that we might be studying? So those sorts of things are really important and easy to miss when you're not kind of in the environment thinking about it. So we want to mimic life as much as possible. So the simulation team that set up the exercise, there's no interaction with them while the simulation is running, so to try and keep it as close to real life as possible. Then the patients and the healthcare professionals in the setting are asked to complete a questionnaire, and then there are semi-structured interviews to identify and focus on the impacts of the participation. So what's our goal? Our goal is to develop these insights that impact the study design, and then how do we take that back to the study team to make changes that are going to really maximise and enhance the patient experience, but make our designs as high quality as possible. And so, as I mentioned, those things then hopefully positively influence all of those aspects: recruitment, retention, ability to comply with the study procedures as well. So what did we get back? So this is just a collection of feedback. So you see at the top here that during the simulation, staff were expected each visit to take 6 hours. Thankfully, it only took half of that time, but that was a great insight to have. The study coordinator felt it was a great opportunity to dry run the protocol to really understand it themselves. The participants felt that informed consent is a hugely important part of the experience in going in clinical trials, and for us to understand how informed consent is and get a perspective on that. So the feedback that the participants felt that they had been adequately informed about the study by the informed consent process gave us a huge amount of validation on the way that informed consent form had been designed. This one makes me smile. So a wide variety of personality types were encountered during the simulation and valuable insight was gathered. So this was a paediatric study and we had teenagers involved who were, in my experience, hugely honest and frank and very valuable then in providing their patient feedback. So they really didn't hold back in telling us what they thought about their experience and the plans that were for the study design. And see here, there's a patient that's saying, no one's even asked me that before. So that's hugely great to see that patients and parents were comfortable disclosing that information. And I think that was important. So this was the first time we'd done this, and there was some hesitancy that you would not necessarily get an honest perspective during the feedback. So it was great that they felt comfortable to share. They were in that site environment. They were familiar with the investigator. Patients were delighted to help and share their perspectives as well. That was the principal investigator felt that. Getting perspectives from patients and the site staff together in the same simulation was also hugely valuable and gave us a lot. And the principal investigator did say that as far as she was concerned, it wasn't just helpful, it was crucial, it was critical to the success of the study. And I can tell you that the design was changed in response to this. So I took this data back, told the team that their duration of placebo was too long, so it was shortened. They also shortened the ratio of placebo that was being given, so there was a much higher weighting towards active versus placebo. But more importantly, I think the expectations were managed much better of the team. So sometimes there can be a perspective of, if we just do it, it will enrol, it will be fine. But actually just knowing how difficult it was going to be enrolled then set the expectations very clearly with the study team that they needed to be prepared for a kind of longer haul on this design. So that worked out well. So patient panel. So Amgen's perspective, and this is a slide we use to internally talk about patient panels within the organisation to train others on the benefits and values that they can bring. So we're looking really to understand again that patient burden, have patient-facing materials reviewed and get feedback on that, and improve the understanding of participation as well to increase enrolment and retention rates. Giving the opportunity to walk in the patient's shoes, I think, is a hugely valuable opportunity for sponsors to be able to do, and it's not something which is as easy to do. And that real-time feedback really important. And validation, it's a huge part of what I do. So you have an assumption, there is a team that have done trials before, or they're hugely knowledgeable in their disease area, and there's a set of assumptions. And a lot of what I do is I validate or I disconfirm. So I'm either telling them that what they think is wrong because what we're hearing from patients or countries is different, or we're saying, yes, you are right, and you can go ahead and be more confident in that assumption that you've made. So understanding perception of products, clinical trials themselves is hugely important. And how trial characteristics impact how a patient experiences a study and what choices they make during that study is hugely important. Online patient communities. So this is something I have less experience with, I'll be transparent. I haven't been closely involved in doing this yet, but this is something which we really feel it's very important to begin and pursue within Amgen, really to start this early. So even before a trial is designed, when we know that we're looking at an indication, to begin to connect with the patient community that's with that indication to understand it better. And then that to begin to inform the team's thinking all the way through the product development, which is hugely important. And then combining that with other techniques as well to kind of open up a whole kind of avenue of getting digital feedback. So for Amgen, this is kind of the unique benefits. And as I say, these are slides which we use within the organisation to kind of promote this tactic to other teams. So from a patient perspective, being able to give patients on-demand access to information and tools, both about their disease, but also when they're in the study about the schedule of events and things like that to be able to look. Obviously, we can reach much more broadly using methods such as this, and the true patient voice in terms of that direct, unfiltered feedback is also really important. And it promotes honest responses as well. And in terms of the limits, there's a piece here around, which is always a concern for Amgen, and many sponsor companies that are working in the social media space, is just about the reporting of adverse events using these models, which is always where with legal and compliance there's the highest level of concern in that if those were reported using that way and then someone didn't pick it up, that would be, hugely impactful and put patient safety at risk. So we need to be very careful in terms of looking at that. I think having more time, so being able to collect information over a wider time frame is important, and I think can create a richer set of data. And conversely, you can do it very quickly as well. So becomes a tool that you could open up a questionnaire and get feedback very quickly, which in trial design is really important for us. So we may have a space of 2 or 3 weeks where a decision has come up that needs to be informed, and we need to go away and get data so that we can support it. And this is just saying here there's a wide range of opportunities that Amgen's identified that we want to be able to utilise this tactic for. So as I mentioned early in therapeutic area development, building that patient journey to understand it better, into clinical trial design, and then even once you've designed and you're running the study, continuing it to understand and optimising the operationalisation of that study. And just also that thirst that many patients have for being connected, and it's not for everyone, we're not making that assumption that everyone is that case, but for certain conditions, if you are more isolated because you're at home, etc., this would give an ability to connect with others with a similar condition or situation. So, any questions on any of the things I've covered before I try and launch us into some discussion? Hi.
I have 2 questions. So one question is, if you do these simulations, at which stage of protocol development do it? Because what I've heard is that you have identified already a site, you have a principal investigator, and you're doing this on-site with, let's say, a real team, plus patients.
Yeah.
For me, it will be difficult in the design phase.
So we have sites that we call reference sites that we work with during our trial design. So we identify them early, and they may not go on to participate in the study at all. And they are a complete mix. Some are key opinion leaders, and others are very experienced trial sites that have done a lot of trial work in the past. And we pre-contract with them for their services at the very beginning, and then we can work with them very quickly then. And this happened, so the study simulation happened. The thing with study simulations, they do take a while to set up. So it's certainly something if it's a tactic you want to use, it's something you do have to think about early. But now we have the kind of contract with the vendor, it would be easier to do it again. So the first time we did it, the contract did take a while. Our study design process is between 12 and 16 weeks. So if we know early before we start the design sessions, which we often do because we collect the feasibility data for 8 to 10 weeks before we go into design, we then conducted the study simulation when the protocol design was matured but wasn't finalised. So we essentially took this feedback into one of the final design sessions, and they made their amendments to the protocol. But this was a design they were having a lot of problems with, so it was delayed as well, so it gave us a bit more time. So the important thing about these tactics, which I should have clarified, is it's really about making sure you match it to where you can add value. Some of them have a high budget implication, so not all teams can utilise them, but also some of them are not suitable because the feedback that would be produced would not necessarily add value. Sometimes trial designs are very fixed because of regulatory obligations, so in those cases we may not be able to influence hugely. And I guess it also depends on what the decisions are that the team have to make and where do we want to, what do we need to inform. So we would choose a tactic or recommend a tactic based on the needs of the design at the time.
I'm curious, how is Amgen measuring the impact of these changes? So in mid-study or end of study to show that these specific changes, the reduced amendments, you have a bigger uptake and retention. How are you systematically capturing the impact of these?
There are so many metrics you can use to measure these, and it's one of my questions about how do we measure that we're being successful. So I think from a very hard endpoint perspective, we can look at how fast our enrolment is, what our retention rates are. What's always difficult is what your baseline is or what your comparator is, because we can obviously look at trials in similar indications a few years ago where we weren't using these kind of tactics and try and compare, but it is difficult to understand if it's this particular thing that's made a trial go faster or is it just circumstance, because often now we're in such a competitive landscape for patients because the choice of studies to go on in some disease areas is much higher. So there's those hard endpoints which we're obviously looking at, and also predictability is important. So are we listening to what we're hearing and managing expectations, as I talked about, is a trial difficult to enrol? Do we need to plan for that, or do we need to plan for it to go much more fast? In terms of seeking other feedback, I think it's about asking the patients themselves about their experience during the trial. So we want to look at questionnaires, talking to the site staff. What's their perspectives in terms of the procedures and the demands that we're placing on patients, and are they reasonable? I do think retention rates are also key as well. So seeing how, do our patients stay in our trials, and are they able to comply with the study requirements? Because it's often not about willingness, it's just about literally the ability to be able to do that in the confines of the disease they have. Hi.
Can I just ask, what's the sample size maybe for at the reference sites, or the number of patients you actually speak with?
So for something like the study simulation, that's quite small. I mean, it's quite expensive to run one of those. So that, I think we had maybe 4 or 5 patients at that site with 2 or 3 site staff. So that was a relatively small but compelling set of feedback because it's so detailed. In terms of those reference sites that we go to, if we're doing a relatively large study, we'll probably go to 2 or 3 from a selection of countries. But again, the questions we ask are very intensive and we need to get the data very quickly. So we use them in quite a directional sense. So we've moved away from asking every single site to complete a questionnaire for feasibility. We actually get country level feedback from people that are Amgen representatives that are in our countries. And they talk a lot to all of internal and external stakeholders. But when we actually go and ask the sites, we target that according to what questions there are and what countries. So often we'll see 1 or 2 sites from the majority of countries. So we might have, on a big trial, 15 to 20 sites providing us feedback.
You want to ask a question?
Just a quick question. Would it ever be valuable to get feedback from patients' caregivers?
Yes.
So, for example, the teenagers, would it be useful to get feedback from their parents to understand how it impacts on them?
Absolutely. And I think just as important, because particularly in those situations, they're not consenting themselves for participation, and family as well. And it's so... the consent process is a key area there in thinking about who really is helping and informing that decision with the patient. And commonly, of course, they're going home and having that discussion with family and friends. And we found in the paediatric study that it was also complex in terms of where parents had separated and there were extended members of the family, so grandparents were very much involved in some of those decisions as well. So providing, for example, online materials that when they've heard about or been talked to about a study by a healthcare professional, they can go home and look at that website together with their family, and allowing that additional time for consent. So something that did come through the study simulation was that consent period, or that time allowed, was greatly appreciated for those extended. But yeah, healthcare, the caregivers are just as important, I think, very important.
My question was, about when, was it always like that, this engagement, this large engagement around patients? Or when do you think it started also in your company? Is it something new, or do you have the feeling you have done that forever?
So, it's a very good question. I feel I've worked in Amgen 11 years, and I feel that as I've designed studies in the time that I've always tried, maybe not always successfully, to think about the patient and how I would feel if I was a parent to put my child in that study, or if I was a patient participating. But I think it's not an objective process, and it's not always a process where you can use that opinion, because that's what that is in that situation, to influence a decision. And I think what we've moved to in the last 3 to 4 years with a centralised design process is a way to collect it as data, and then use it to inform decisions, and then potentially store it in a good, in a knowledge management system, and then we can use it again to inform another decision. So it's structured now, and it was unstructured. I think it was there before, but it was unstructured, because if you asked any team, they would know the patient that they wanted to include in the study, but did they really know them? And so now it's kind of, we're able to challenge it in a more structured way. Yeah. So this approach is new, but I think the being patient focused is not a new thing for Amgen, I wouldn't say.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.